our portrayal of modern history, which is based on Europe and Europeans as actors, and all other people in the world as either inert or obstinate obstacles to progress or innocent victims of imperialism. These are the two theories, which are both two sides of the same coin. That is, in either case, the colonized peoples are denied their role as actors in the world. So we have a situation where the Europeans are basically actors. And if one just looks at a political map of the world, it's very difficult to say anything else about it in a period like the 19th century, when the European countries were going conquering everywhere else and imposing their colonial rule on the other in various places. It's hard to conceive of the other people as actors in that sense anyway, maybe even in their own local histories to this day. The European intrusion is a very big, important theme in the world's history of those times. But generally, the idea is that the first spark of freedom, and indeed, according to one of the writers about the subject, a political scientist, the first spark of nationalism is the revolutions of Latin America against the Spanish and Portuguese rulers and the independence of the Latin American countries. And that kind of serves as a model for the much, much later post-World War II independence of the African and Asian countries. So we have this idea of independence. And we have in the United Nations the idea of the theoretical equality of all the members of the United Nations, one country, one vote, which admittedly is a concession from the large states to the smaller. After all, if the Seychelles Islands or whatever, Singapore has a vote equivalent to the United States of America, which has hundreds of times as many people and so forth, then that is a concession by the major powers to the minor states, perhaps something along the lines of the US Senate, where states like Vermont and Wyoming and Alaska, you have two senators like California, which has not 100 times as many people, but close to it. It would have something on the order of 70 times as many people as Wyoming. And so it might be a kind of concession on that order. But still, there's some idea of equality in that each national flag flies in alphabetical order in front of the United Nations building and so on. And some nativist nationalists in the United States resent that because they think, oh, the United Nations is just a waste of money. Oh, why, the United States has hardly any influence. Why should it foot a quarter of the bill? And so, anti-UN type of thing. And the idea, nevertheless, that each country is an independent sovereignty and that its independence means that it has a kind of equivalence of the political freedom that individual humans have in the United States under its Constitution is a prevalent idea. And at one time, there was more sense to regarding things that way. Now, if we look at Arnold Toynbee's scheme of history and how a civilization, a discrete civilization in its development, starts out as a constellation of city-states or of small states. In the case of Europe, of territorial kingdoms, say, in the early modern period, which once they had gotten rid of feudal lords and had formed national states, they were competing states that were fighting each other and at war with each other until, according to Toynbee, one of them delivers the knockout blow, and then at that point establishes a universal empire that rules over, lords over, and controls everything effectively. And in the case of the Chinese states, there was the period of contending states before the Han Empire was founded, where the Qin, the state ruled by the first emperor, which was a marginal geographic state at the frontier fringes of China, went back into the center, conquered the center, and established the Chinese empire and the unified state, which has not ceased to be a unified state till this point. Or in the Greco-Roman world, the constellation of Greek city-states and then Hellenistic kingdoms, was replaced by, at least in the Mediterranean area, a universal Roman Empire that controlled and dominated everything. So by Toynbee's model, one would expect European history to follow the same path, and I think now in the year 2000, it is secure to say that it has done so. Yes?
Let me hit you with a Tom Brokaw, greatest generation type of idea, in that the United States is a shining example of a powerful country which could have imposed political control over much of the earth, and yet did not. Our armies marched out of the countries that we liberated during World War II, as opposed to the Soviets who kept control of their countries. I mean, economic imperialism is one thing, but people still have their own rulers. Nobody's pushing a McDonald's down somebody's throat.
Bear with me. Look, ancient Athens, which is held up as the epitome of democracy in spite of the ancient lack of political rights for women and slaves, and also for foreigners, and Athens' unwillingness to naturalize any foreigners as citizens after the law of about 454 BC, carried through by the brilliant Democrat Pericles, which stated that no person could have Athenian citizenship unless they had both parents Athenians, not just one. A foreign mother denied you citizenship, and you came into the metic class there, except by an act of parliament. That is, the assembly of all adult males of Athens could grant citizenship. And if you thought that would be difficult, it was. It was very difficult. So extremely exclusivist citizenship law. Nevertheless, in the period of the Athenian Empire, the Peloponnesian War, which is described in extreme and lurid detail by Thucydides and his continuator Xenophon, you observe that the Athenians went around overthrowing oligarchies and imposing democracies on city-states around the Aegean. And when their enemies, the Spartans, who favored the oligarchical party, would come, they would come and overthrow the democrats and restore the oligarchy. And the illustration of this is very clear if you take the Athenian ally of Corcyra and the civil war at Corcyra in 427 BC, you can see with great clarity there that there was a local party of Democrats, that they were encouraged and supported by the Athenians, but the Athenians weren't occupying the country and weren't literally imposing their own government on the place, but nevertheless Corcyra was aligned with the Athenian Empire. And so, maybe I'm saying that by way of making some concession to what you just said. Nevertheless, you're going to get something else. And it would work like this, that Europe thought of itself as the central place. The United States was marginal, although some far-sighted European politicians saw the resources of the United States and its great territorial extent in the 19th century already as a possible future power that could threaten the dominance of the Europeans. Nevertheless, by 1914, very few people regarded the United States as being the paramount power in the world. And even if it had a paramountcy in the sense that it had an edge on any other particular place, it was most certainly not lording it over European countries, not in 1914. It had been very recent of memory that there had been a huge amount of English capital investment in the United States that had made the United States somewhat of an economic colony of Europe. But that was shifting and changing by 1914. After all, it was a sign of the times that the famous ill-fated Titanic of the British White Star Line, the pride of the British ocean liners, was actually owned by J.P. Morgan, who was an American. And that showed the way the wind was blowing economically at that time already. And indeed, the facts were that the United States by 1914 had already eclipsed Germany and Britain as superior power, but it hadn't come out yet. The American Navy wasn't yet as big as the British, and the American Army, except in wartime, was non-existent, and so on. And in World War I, the European powers just destroyed each other, and the total dominance of the United States over the earth was plenty evident by 1918. Now, the results of World War I were the destruction of Austria-Hungary, which was not a real contender for paramountcy in the world, the isolation of Russia under the Soviet system, where it seemed to go into a very backward, defeated state, the destruction of the Ottoman Empire, which had not been in any case considered a contender, as it had actually been colonized. And previously, Spain had been removed from any possible remains of thinking of last glory by the Spanish-American War. And Italy was shown up also to be pretty much of a paper tiger and so on. But Britain and France, the victors too, they were bled white, as evidenced by their almost complete unwillingness to face Hitler, even when he had inferior forces in 1936 and 1938 and so on. And also, the credit relationship changed because Britain and France became totally indebted to the United States. So, the United States, something on the model of Rome in 3rd century BC Italy, integrated these countries into an American system gradually, but in the interwar period, not officially. It was unofficially through economic ties. But after the interwar period, in the post-World War II period, officially in the NATO alliance, which resembles the Romans' assimilation of Italians into a system of city-states where some of them had Roman rights and some of them had Latin rights and so forth. And the interwar period is very interesting because there is a lopsided view of history that emerges from concentrating on only one theme of Nazi Germany, which is its anti-Semitism. And although that theme is important and could even be viewed as central to Nazi Germany, yet it ignores the fact that for most of the German people and the other people living in Europe, that the most salient facts were the normal political facts of the existence of Germany at that time. And I am talking here about Germany's adoption of fascist state policies, preceded by Mussolini's Italy in 1922, but what is usually ignored is that all of the countries of Eastern Europe adopted the same system. Go through them. Not quite all. If you considered Finland to be Eastern Europe, it didn't do it, and Czechoslovakia didn't do it. Czechoslovakia remained democratic, but otherwise every other country established a fascist dictatorship. Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Poland, Hungary, Austria, Yugoslavia, Romania, Bulgaria, Albania, Greece, Turkey, Iran, Afghanistan, Japan, all the independent countries established fascist systems at the same time. Now, they didn't all have the anti-Semitic element, which seems to be peculiarly associated with the German state mainly. And where it manifested itself in Romania, for example, it seems to be usually connected with German influence, or in Italy after the Pact of Steel between Mussolini and Hitler in 1938. But these states all established this, and the Soviet Union. Now, one would say, what? No, the Soviet Union, that was communist, socialist, it wasn't fascist. Well, isn't Hitler a national socialist? I mean, the thing was that in each case, the Soviet state resembled the Nazi state very much, except only in the detail that since there were only half Russians in it, they couldn't emphasize Russian nationality. So they said, all of the Soviet nationalities are good. So communism was simply a vehicle for being multinational, that's all. Whereas in Germany, it was homogeneous enough they could say German, 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 and they would get away with that. So you have the Soviet system exactly resembling all these others. And every one of these states, in its fascist dictatorial form, established a central state system, controls on contacts with foreigners, discouraged tourism, was suspicious of that, had secret police to enforce the authoritarianism of the state, lest there be any cracks or chinks in the wall, established central control over trade, foreign trade, And all of them had non-convertible, non-hard currencies, and so they had to establish currency controls, prohibited the export of their currencies, and did not allow individual citizens to barter with other countries, but rather they carried through trade on their own and often through barter agreements with other like states, since they had no hard currency. In other words, the Western countries, which did have convertible currencies and were all in the system together, the United States, Britain, France, Holland, Belgium, Luxembourg, Switzerland, Norway, Sweden, and Denmark, all of these countries that had the convertible currencies and were of a system together with each other, they in effect were a thesis which called forth the fascist antithesis. And fascism can then be seen as a defensive attempt to protect the independence of the state, the small state, by sacrificing the rights of the individual for the sake of the group.
Excuse me, this is all very interesting, but what does it have to do with this question or topic?
Well, the independentism was something that the states of the world tried to establish because any political system will try to resist outside domination. And the results of World War II were that Germany, Italy, and Japan were crushed and remain filled with American military bases to this day. The other fascist states that existed all disappeared. Even Turkey, which was neutral in the war, associated itself with the NATO alliance in 1950. And what it has to do with this question is that, yes, there is an American domination of the world, and that's very plainly clear. And it is not something that involves American governors sitting and dictating to the rulers of places, although the American ambassador is very often influential in various places. But it does involve a considerable power intrusion into the politics of other places. And it is out of the question to say that there is any threat to this domination that exists now, except for one, which is the fact that atomic weapons exist and that those would destroy civilization. And several of those do not exist in countries other than those that are part of the American system. And that includes, in particular, China, most significantly, and also Russia, which oddly has not been incorporated in the system, even though it would probably love to join it. And so when you, yes?
Sorry, but the dominance of American civilization. I mean, I see the world as having evolved now into trade blocks. I see the trade blocks as being much more, or perhaps as important as national country blocks. In other words, we are in fierce competition with the European common market. We are not dominating them. In a free market economy, when they get together, their companies have an advantage. I think it's enormously unfair and inaccurate to equate American civilization with our armies placed in foreign countries with something like the Roman Empire, where those armies would be used to suppress the local people.
Well, but they may have not always been viewed so in the Roman Empire. The Roman Empire was characterized on the whole by very few local revolts. And in fact, many of the provinces in the Roman Empire that consisted of non-Latin speaking people had no troops in them. Like, for example, the densely populated province of Asia in Western Asia Minor, where Ephesus was located. There were no Roman troops there other than local police who probably were recruited from the local population. It shouldn't be imagined that the presence of American troops in a place is just value neutral. It's not. And if you think that I am observing this and I am, off the wall, well, okay, but the way that is observed by people outside is something that one ought to consider. Now,